Thank you for joining us for today's conversation entitled Food Insecurity and Ending Food Waste Through Food Donations. Why don't we give it a minute to allow as many people as possible? We had so many people sign up for today's conversation. We want to make sure that we give the audience an opportunity to join us. So we will start in about 1 minute. So thank you again for being here with us. We are looking forward to a dynamic conversation. We have a great panel here with us today. And as was noted in your registration, the Q&A section is open throughout our conversation. I know many of you provided us with questions at the time that you registered, and we'll try and answer as many of those questions as possible. But if while we're talking, something comes to mind and you want us to answer a question, please add it to the Q&A list, and we'll try and get that into this conversation as well. With that, let me start with the introduction of our fantastic panel that we have in front of us today. First of all, we have Emily Broadleib. Emily is a clinical professor of law and the founding director of the Harvard Law School's Food Law and Policy Clinic, the nation's first school clinic devoted to providing legal and policy solutions to the health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. She is also the faculty director of the Harvard Law School Center for Health, Law, Policy, and Innovation. Working directly with clients and communities, Emily champions community-led food system change, reduction in food waste, food security, and access to healthy foods, and equity and sustainability in food production. Thank you for joining us, Emily. We're also joined today by Leah Lizarrando, and Leah is the founder of the Food Rescue Hero, a transformative technology that turns food resources into movements to have a greater impact on food waste, climate change, and hunger. Leah's work in food recovery has been featured on the Today Show and NPR, and she's been written about in Fast Company and the Washington Post, among others. Leah's won numerous awards for her work, including Vital Voices Global Leadership Award in 2020 and the We Empower UN SDG Challenge in 2019, a global award for women social entrepreneurs. Leah received her graduate degree in public policy and technology from Carnegie Mellon University. She is originally from the Philippines and currently lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Leah, we're so glad you're with us today. Then we have Vince Hall. Vince serves as the Chief Government Relations Officer for Feeding America and leads the development and execution of Feeding America's public policy. Their public policy, their legislative and advocacy strategies to empower communities and improve food security. Vince helps lead efforts to end hunger by advocating for policy changes, supporting advocacy capacity across the network, increasing neighbor enrollment in public benefits, and building partnerships that amplify our collective voice. Prior to joining Feeding America, Vince served as the CEO of Feeding San Diego, the leading hunger relief and food rescue organization in San Diego County, and the only Feeding America Network member food bank in the southern region of California. Vince, we're delighted to have you here, and congratulations to Feeding America for now being the #1 charity in the United States, as well as the #1 food security organization in our nation.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Let me begin by stating, for those of us who work in the food community, we understand, but others might not. When we use the term food waste, we're referring to food that is fit for human consumption, but consciously discarded. And in the US, food waste occurs primarily at the retail and consumer level. But as our panelists will, I'm sure, highlight, waste occurs at the farm during storage, processing, distribution, as well as at the retail and household level. There is nothing new about the capture and distribution of food that might otherwise be lost, as I described. Organizations here in the US, including Feeding America and many others, including gleaners groups across the country, have long captured and distributed this food through the charitable food system. The Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Act of 1996 created legislative protection from liability for consumption of donated food. This protection extends to food manufacturers, grocery retailers, and other actors across the food system, including those gleaners I spoke about. This act, as well as the enhanced tax deduction for food donation, opened the door to increased charitable food donations. And then last year, the Food Donation Improvement Act recognized the growing challenge of food deserts in our urban and rural communities. And there is a need, we recognize that there is a need for additional solutions to address food insecurity and malnutrition. As such, the act extends and expands the liability protection to foods sold for a defined Good Samaritan price. We're joined by a panel of experts today to discuss what all this really means for ending hunger in America, for addressing challenges of malnutrition in America. And so let's get right into it because we have great experts and we want to start with you, Emily, I top lined what all of this, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act address and the Food Donation Act. Can you tell us more about the coalition that came together in support of this bill and why now? And what are the events that laid the foundation for the FDIA's passage and why the coalition thought it was important and Congress embraced that leadership to sign this bill?
Great. Well, thank you, first of all, for hosting this. I'm so excited. This is a really great group. So excited for the conversation. You gave me a big question there, Arthur. And so let me try to break it down. I think kind of like two main things. Why is this so important? Like why spend the time to make this? What does it do? And then to your point, how is this possible? How does someone get something through Congress these days where most of what we hear is about how things don't move forward? And I think this was a real like bipartisan initiative to really get this enacted at the end of last year, the end of last Congress. So I think, as you sort of mentioned, first, we waste so much food in this country. The large majority of that food is safe and edible. So that's really important. And then I think we know that there's a hierarchy to what we're supposed to do with this surplus food that we have in the US. So this comes from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And it really says that first, we want to prevent food from being wasted. That's really important. It's a huge drain on the environment and on the climate when we produce food and then throw it away. So the first thing is prevent it. And then the next most important thing is to make sure if we've really invested all these resources to produce food, to make sure that food gets to people. And then below that, if it can't get to people, go to animals. There's other, compost and anaerobic. I mean, we want to keep it out of the landfill, but there's really an imperative to get food to people if it is safe and edible. And yet, less than 10% of the surplus food in the US currently gets donated to people. There's a bunch of reasons why. I think you kind of referred to two. One is this concern over liability. Businesses would say, if I'm not making money by selling this, why do I want to take a risk that someone will get sick and come back and sue me? And then the other is the cost. And I think this is where, I know maybe we'll get to it later, the tax incentive gets into it. I mean, it is not free to put food to the side, have a separate storage for it, train your staff and make sure it gets to people. So those are two of the big barriers. On the liability protection, the US actually was a global leader in enacting the first liability protection in the Emerson Act in 1996. It protects both food businesses and then also the nonprofits that collect that food and distribute it to people in need, like Feeding America and like Food Rescue Hero and the groups that it works with. And yet in the lead up to the Food Donation Improvement Act, more than 50% of businesses still said that the top reason they didn't donate was because of fear of liability. So we've been sitting here for years saying, like, what can we do? You know, what's the real barrier? We have this protection, and there were three main things that were included in this law to address some of those concerns. One was that under the prior Emerson Act, you would only receive protection if the food went to a nonprofit that then gave it away. That is still going to be the primary way that food gets donated. But I think we saw a lot during COVID, the need for flexibility. And there were a lot of like farmers and schools that were left with extra food. And some of the food rescue organizations and food banks were like, we're bombarded right now. We can't drive out and pick all of this up. So it gives some flexibility in protecting food from certain donors that goes straight to people who need it. The second is that it protects food when it goes to a nonprofit that sells that food at a low cost. And again, this also was an issue before COVID, but I think became even more clear during this time of major upheaval that it's not free to drive around, pick up food, and then take it somewhere, pay some staff to be staffing your organization. And so allowing protection, even if that food is sold at a low cost. This is only for nonprofits. So all the money they bring in goes to them just picking up and distributing more food. And then the third thing that was in the original bill and was not in the final enacted bill, and I want to come back to it, is that we need better guidance. So we end up as a legal organization answering all these questions that businesses, like I'm constantly on the phone with businesses saying, if I take this food and handle it in this way and then donate it, will I receive protection? And we're happy to help with that, but it doesn't make sense that there's not clear guidance or clearly an agency that in the federal government that businesses can go to get correct, accurate answers that they can rely on. And so that's something I think we need to keep working on. I know you also asked me to go over the coalition that got it passed. You want me to pause there so you can bring everyone in?
Okay, you can come back to it. Why don't you pause there?
Talk all day, but I know I want to hear what
I appreciate that. The things you're saying are quite important, and I'm sure our audience is taking it all in and writing it all down because it is all quite important to how we go forward. Let me go to Vince, though, and ask, as the largest food waste rescue organization in the U.S. last year, Feeding America diverted 3.6 billion pounds of groceries to food banks. In what ways do the liability protections that Emily's just been talking about, offered through the Food Donation Improvement Act, make it easier or more challenging for both local, large nonprofits like Feeding America and smaller food banks and food donation services to get more of what they need to serve those who need it most?
Well, I think it's a great question, but I want to just start by thanking you for inviting me to be a part of the panel today, and thank you to those attending for your interest in the issue. I before becoming the Chief Government Relations Officer for Feeding America, as you said in your generous introduction, had the honor of serving as the CEO of Feeding San Diego. And in California, we worked with our state legislature to enhance the liability protections expressed in state law to mirror the federal protections and to make sure that for the food donors, there was absolute clarity about the universal levels of protection that they had from liability. What was stunning to me as a food banker is the number of folks involved in the food supply chain who are operating on the basis of myth as opposed to fact when it comes to food liability. That even though there are robust protections through these laws, that there is a lack of comprehensive understanding and education within the potential donor community about the extent to which liability is protected and even the legality of donations. I can't tell you how many times, at least a dozen, that I was in the process of asking somebody to become a food donor only to find them say, but it's not legal for me to do that. Mm-hmm. So in some respects, strengthening laws is a necessary and effective step, but an even larger ability to educate potential donors about the laws that exist is an even stronger ability in some areas to increase food donation. I mean, the one thing that we all agree on is that we throw away more food in this country than is necessary to solve hunger, which is an incredibly troubling reality when you consider that this country is rapidly moving from a pandemic crisis to a hunger crisis, the termination of very robust federal programs that were meant to address the pandemic those programs have now been phased out, and that the level of hunger that we're seeing in communities all across the country, urban, rural, is astounding. And so having a robust conversation about how we prevent less edible food from going to the landfill and more edible food to people in poverty is a really important and timely conversation.
Well, that's really helpful to understand what we need to do to bring awareness to the food loss crisis. At 40%, that is a crisis in this country, and the opportunity that crisis provides for us to address the hunger needs of so many who are facing hunger in a land, as many describe it, a land of plenty. Let me come to you, Leah. You founded the Food Rescue Heroes. You work at the intersection of food, health, and technologies. While we're talking about the act itself, in what ways does first of all, tell us about your organization and what it does, and then in what ways does the Food Donation Improvement Act support a food policy landscape that allows organizations like yours, Food Rescue, to both scale your operations and more effectively divert food from landfills?
Yes. So I think one of the most important things that I want to underscore is that, what we're really kind of best at, not us, but in general as a hunger organization or hunger nonprofits in terms of food recovery, is really recovering food at the earlier stages of the supply chain. Because we have the truck and warehouse models that support that. So let's say, a large, and
Leah,
there's there that is,
we lost your sound for a moment. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
that is short dated. They can dispatch, the local food bank can dispatch their truck and then take that food, bring it back to their warehouse, do all the sorting, and then the redistribution from there. What's very difficult is, as you mentioned, is that, and what our logistics system can't support yet, is what you mentioned as the retail level of the supply chain. And that is difficult because the instances of food surplus at each location is really too small for a truck to cost effectively recover. So you're thinking in one grocery store, it's going to be 2 boxes of food. Right. So when we interview our colleagues at these grocery, large grocery chains, small grocery chains, their issue is really the daily food surplus. And what they've been finding is a difficulty in making sure that these 2 boxes of produce, and 1 box of mixed groceries get rescued reliably every single day. And so that's where Food Rescue Hero comes in. The reason why this food can't be recovered is that there's no cost-effective way to do it. So the grocers don't have, the structure to dispatch staff every day in many different locations to many different charities and pantries. And the nonprofits that receive this food, don't have the capacity to reliably take the food every day as well. As we know, our nonprofits are really strapped for resources. So really, when you think about this kind of double-ended problem, there really needs to be a support for transporting food in between. And we have that. We use it every day ourselves. It's called, Uber Eats or DoorDash or all of those delivery services that deliver small quantities of food. But then how do you do it for food that has, in a way, no one wants to pay for it, no one can pay for it? And so you need that transport, the cost of that transport to be near zero. And so what Food Rescue Hero does is really, I would say it's a DoorDash or Uber Eats for surplus food. We take the cars and the time and, and people who want to help, and we we kind of aggregate all of these folks who really want to do something every day, and they download the app, and then they're the ones to transport the food. So in the 6 years that we've been operating, over 350,000 trips have been taken by these volunteers to move about 160 million pounds of food all over, the US and Canada. And again, the cost of transport is really nearly zero.
Wow.
And so that's really currently the only viable way to transport this retail level food surplus. So that's what we do. And the Food Donation Improvement Act, as Emily mentioned, disambiguates a lot of the liability that a lot of our food retailers, our potential food donors feel or thought they had, and really gives them, the definitions, or most of the definitions that they need, so that they know, that they can safely donate food. And that has allowed our operations to grow, the number of donors that our partners have. And again, when we go to the local level, at least they have something to refer to.
So, Emily, let me come back to you for a moment and start with what we heard from both Leah and from Vince about awareness and the increased donations. Tell me how you see this act is making a difference in donor perception is about what they can provide.
It's a really good question, and I think kind of also ties into the point I didn't get to make in the last question, which was like, how did we get enough support to make this happen? And it really was, it's something that we've been working on for some time. There were versions of this act were introduced not just in last Congress when it passed, but in the Congress before that and in the Congress before that. So it took some time. But it was a small chorus. Like, we were talking about it because we had talked with a lot of local food rescue organizations facing these challenges. There were a lot of, as Vince alluded to, there was a lot of momentum in state policy trying to address some of these challenges. But actually during like 2021, 2022, I think, again, as a result of more awareness on food during the pandemic, this Healthy Living Coalition came together that was really shepherded by Weight Watchers, interestingly, but with a whole bunch of different members and counterparts. And they said, we want to donate more, and these are the barriers. So there are 3 barriers, and they have an open letter signed by more than 50 organizations. They said our barriers are lack of clarity on the liability protection and these certain types of donation not being protected. To Vince's point, lack of clarity on the food safety rules. People, like Vince said, they say, I don't even know if we're allowed to donate this. The number of people that say, oh, but you can't donate prepared food, or you're not allowed to donate that, or you can't donate past date food. So, and then the last was the tax, issues, questions about the tax benefit that exists. So they wrote this letter, and then we kind of teamed up, and I think getting on the radar that there were so many voices from academia, from civil society, from food rescue organizations, and also from industry, all saying together, this will make a difference, really help get this across the finish line. I mentioned one of the biggest challenges that has not been solved was that when Congress passed the original Emerson Act, they didn't, normally Congress passes a law and they tell an agency that they're in charge of shepherding that law along. And this was an interesting one where Congress passed the Emerson Act and then didn't tell anyone to be in charge of it. So the problem for a long time has been, if you're a business and you just wanted to go to someone in government and say, what does this word mean? There's no one to ask. Congress doesn't pick up the phone and answer questions. So this was a really big barrier. The reason it got left out of the law at the last minute was that the law as written had put that on the shoulders of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which I think makes sense. They're the main agency that's really spent the most time thinking about food recovery. But the question was, we also have a Food and Drug Administration that oversees a lot of the food supply. So in the end, Congress said, we don't have enough time. We see a window, we can move this along now. We can't get everyone at the table from all the relevant committees. But I think that there was an agreement on the part of USDA to really work on some guidance on that. And I think, you know, and I'd be curious for others, I could list out, here are the things that as a lawyer, I look at this law and I think Congress clearly wanted to make it really accessible, wanted people to be able to donate and feel really comfortable. But there's some outstanding questions that just in the language of the legislation itself aren't really addressed. And I think this would be a great opportunity for anyone on here who's saying, okay, how do we really unlock the potential for this? I think getting really clear guidance that comes out that answers questions, and often with guidance, agencies can put something out and then they can ask nonprofits and businesses, reply back to us, like respond to this guidance. What are we missing? I think that's really gonna, you know, really help make all the lawyers out there that are trying to do the best for their companies feel the most comfortable with doing this.
So Vince, let me come to you, because as the largest organization representing food banks, large and small, with some 50,000 food pantries and other facilities distributing food, what more would you like to see? As Emily described some of the what she sees as the missing pieces from a legislative standpoint, what more would you like to see, or Feeding America like to see in the landscape? In the legislative landscape to support food donation or food donation policies in particular, that will help us support a more resilient food system from production to consumption, and addressing specifically the issue of how we capture more of the food loss in the system.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I go back to something Leah said, which is that the infrastructure of handling donated food and moving it to communities in need is very expensive. And you know, America's food banks are investing over $1 billion this year in capital improvements designed to increase their capacity to handle not just food, but healthy food. And a big part of the capital investments that are being made in food banks are the infrastructure of coolers and cold storage and refrigerated trucks and things that allow us to generate more fresh produce and healthy proteins like meat and chicken and fish for communities. And at that, food banks have been very, very successful. But, you know, some of the primary drivers of food rescue are the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1935 and Section 32 bonus buys, which are the federal government essentially supporting farm prices for agricultural producers by buying up surplus commodities that would otherwise go to waste. They then distribute those commodities through the food banking system, but Congress, and this is not a USDA issue, this is a Congress issue. Congress has never fully reimbursed food banks for the cost of distributing that rescued food. And so by investing more in the capacity of pantries and food banks to do this work, it not only means that the federal purchased commodities, which are coming through those pipelines, are meeting the necessary infrastructure of distribution, but then that distribution infrastructure is leveraged to help process so much other food that is coming from non-governmental sources. You know, when I was a food banker in California, the California Association of Food Banks had a farm to family program. There were 240 farms and packing sheds up and down the state of California that were contributing food, and it's more today, to that program. So I, as a food banker in San Diego, we're just reaping the abundance of fresh produce from all over the state of California. But here's the thing, many of those crops were lying ripe in the field without a buyer. And so I grew up in farm country in California. I grew up watching perfectly edible food get tilled back into the soil. Now food banks through the Farm to Food Bank program are able to pay the pick and pack out fee, meaning they're actually going to minimize the loss to the farmer by paying the labor cost of harvesting that crop, paying the cost of packing it, and paying the cost of shipping it to a food bank. And in doing so, the farmer still enjoys the tax benefits of donating the commodity, but the end result is that people in communities of need have free access to this food that otherwise would have gone to waste. But that's expensive. And you know, whether it's through grants that come from charitable foundations, whether it's the government fully reimbursing for the cost of the commodities that they rescue and distribute. It's really important that we not just pay attention to the value of the food that's coming through the charitable food system, but leverage the statistics on food to emphasize the cost of the infrastructure. And I just have to add one last thought, which is it's so much more expensive today than it was 3 years ago. The cost of fuel, the cost of labor, the cost of cold storage, everything that we do is necessitating a significantly increased investment in those capital and operational expenses.
Mhm.
And Arthur, and to your point, I just want to add one thing onto what Vince said, which I agree with all of that. And I think it's to say that this year, another big opportunity, we're going to be looking at the next farm bill. And this is a huge opportunity. Before the last US farm bill, which was 5 years ago, there was not a single dollar spent on we spent all this money, $500 billion over 5 years or almost 500 billion on getting, paying for farmers to produce food, et cetera, and not a single dollar on making sure that food didn't get wasted. So some of these programs, like the Farm to Food Bank program, started there. This is a great opportunity. And then I think the second is that investing in food banks and food recovery infrastructure is an infrastructure investment that not only gets food to people, but creates jobs. And the states that we've seen, like Massachusetts, which have really invested in reducing food waste, have seen huge job creation, more revenue. I mean, so I think we talk about infrastructure. This should be part of that conversation too. So just to add on to what Vince said, endorse 100%. This is so important.
Mm-hmm. So Leah, but the issues that Vincent just raised, I think, are quite critical to the charitable food system and ensuring that we carry forward these programs, but also make them more affordable for food banks to actually not only perform the work of gleaning the food and gathering food, but distributing that food once it is donated. The question I have for you is, what role do you see private sector playing in addressing and supporting this transition that Vince is talking about, that will support accessing more nutritious food? Besides the work that the food banks do, what else can private sector do to ensure that we're capturing more of this food waste, and that food waste is then being used to address issues of hunger?
Yeah. So, the biggest thing that they can do is to impute, food recovery within normal operations, right? Not as an exception, because, all the actors in every step of the supply chain already know that there is food surplus that is going to waste. Maybe 10 years ago the awareness was there, but the public awareness wasn't. And so now there's pressure not only from within, but also externally, from the public, as we, learn more about how food waste happens and then its impact on hunger on the other side. So, for instance, for us, when we work with grocery stores, grocery store margins are extremely thin. And so any change in operations can impact that margin. However, if we look at, existing ways or really simple ways to redirect food, 52% of food that goes to waste is produce, it's fruits and vegetables. And so when you're addressing food waste, you're not only addressing caloric needs, which is often, the only minimum or the maximum that some families that are, experiencing food insecurity can do. But if we are effectively redirecting the fresh produce, of which, again, it's 52%. So when you look at 65 million tons of food, going to waste each year, that's 30 million tons of food. We can't even picture how much fruits and vegetables that is. So if we impute it in, if the private sectors impute it in within general, their normal operations, then we can now hope to not only address, caloric security, but actually nutrition security.
If I can just jump in and build on that a little bit, because I love that sentiment about just building it into the operational plan. And I would say that on the charitable side, many food banks are also building what's called agency-enabled retail rescue into their operational plan, which is that we don't throttle and limit the ability to rescue food based on the ability of that food bank to physically drive a truck to the store, bring it back to the food bank, and then get it out to a charitable partner. But we run a matching service that matches food donors to local charities that can rescue that food, keep it in community. And when you do that, three things happen. I mean, one is that you dramatically lower the expense associated with the food rescue operation. Two is that you ensure that more of the food is edible when it reaches a family, because it's sometimes getting to them within hours of being rescued. And three is that you reduce the climate impact of the food rescue system, because you don't have trucks running all over the county. You have local food staying in local communities. And Feeding San Diego, the food bank that I had the honor of leading, is one of the food banks that has reached 100% agency enablement on food rescue. And we had that across 300 food donors, everything from the famous San Diego Zoo to the airport to all the major grocery stores in town, quite a few of the smaller stores. So I appreciate that sentiment. And I would say that that applies to the business sector. It also applies to the charitable sector. And the other thing is, I love the call out, Leah, to technology, because I was able to partake in the launch of Feeding America's Meal Connect app in San Diego, which allowed occasional donors, people that can't donate food on a schedule because they simply don't have that consistency of donatable food, with a technology platform that was downloaded from the iPhone or Android store that allowed an occasional donor, like a restaurant or a small grocery store, to, with a couple of clicks on the phone, take a picture of the donation. A volunteer who had been trained in food safety standards and had necessary food safety equipment in their vehicle was dispatched to that location and then able to get it to a local charity that had agreed to accept the food. So great point about the fact that technology is a massive unlock toward efficiency. But again, it's another capital expense. It's another infrastructure cost that we have to be willing to invest in order to lift up the capacity of everybody to engage in food rescue in a country that throws away more food than is necessary to solve hunger.
Right. And then I think one last thing I'd like to add to that is that, for businesses to be able to, again, kind of consider food rescue naturally in their operations, on the other side, there has to be, exceptional commitment to reliability for people who, for the agencies or the individuals that pick up, and to the level that commercial services provide. And I think that's still the big opportunity that a lot of agency enablement has. And so it's great to kind of augment that with the power of actual citizens living in that city or that community and locality. And that's what Food Rescue Hero does. It takes the effort and the burden away from already strapped agencies and actually just tells them, don't worry, we'll pick it up just as easily as any commercial service does. And that reliability provided to the grocery store, because there's nothing worse than a store manager preparing 3 boxes of food and no one getting there at the end of the day to pick it up. And if that happens day after day after day, the compliance and really the motivation of that store to donate, kind of decreases again, because it's such a very exactly designed operation. So involving the community, through technology in very real ways, and making sure that the reliability rates are 99%, then that helps the store say that, yes, we can do this because, you're giving us that guarantee.
So we're hearing about new strategies and new tools. And Vince, you talked specifically about the farm to food bank program and the differences that it's made to all of you. Do we have the policies at the federal level that we need to scale up these new strategies? And if not, what types of new policy changes should we look to Congress for, whether it's through the Farm Bill or through other mechanisms, to support the scale up of new tools that will allow us to access more food and distribute more food to those in need? Let's start with you, Emily.
So how much time do you have, Arthur? I mean, I think, I sort of alluded to this, the last Farm Bill, we kind of scratched the surface, we put some things in there, a bunch of little pilots. Some, I mean, not even little, some of them are quite substantial, like the Farm to Food Bank funding. So this is funding that states can add to their plans for their emergency food assistance program funding that's particularly to support the cost of harvesting food and getting it to food banks. So it helps with the cost of farms don't want to harvest food they're not going to sell. They don't have extra money to pay laborers to do that. So it covers that cost, transportation, and to the point that Leah made on nutrition security, it's a great value add because it brings fresher food into food banks and into people's homes. But I think, that taking a big step back, we set a goal as a nation in 2015 to halve our food waste by 2030. And I would say, like, the data is showing that we are not on track to get there at all. We are, if anything, ReFed, which is a great partner organization of ours that tracks a lot of data on food waste, is actually showing that, if anything, maybe we're increasing in the amount of food waste being generated. So again, food rescue, food recovery, we have this imperative to keep that at the top of our solutions, but across all those opportunities, I think there's a lot to do. So maybe a couple of key things I think we can do. One thing I want to mention is we last month launched a coalition of my organization, the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, alongside ReFed, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and WWF. We've been working together for a while on food waste policy. We all work with lots of local partners. We launched what we're calling the Zero Food Waste Coalition as a way to really try to make our voices louder. And, building from the experience last year with the Food Donation Improvement Act, the more we can be saying the same thing or similar things, the more success we'll have. And then the other idea of it was really to be able to bring in a lot of other local partners that have great experience, great stories, and have needs, but are having trouble figuring out how do you really engage with Congress on things like the Farm Bill. So that's one thing. There's a lot of resources on that site, including a report on what we think should be in the Farm Bill, and a recent report that's a toolkit for states on best practices for state policy. Three things, if I had to say, three things I think we really should do. One is there's now, as of the last Farm Bill, a liaison at USDA on food loss and waste. It's one person. If we really are serious about this, we're going to need more than one. I mean, it's a great person. She's working really hard. She's barely sleeping, but we're going to need more than a person. So, we need an office. They need some resources to be able to do better research, and then to kind of put out funding where those gaps exist that we've all been talking about, where there are opportunities. So that's one. Another big thing I think is investing in exactly what we're talking about. So that is funding for kind of the infrastructure needs to really redistribute food, and then where that food isn't safe for consumption, to invest in the infrastructure for either getting it to be animal feed or compost or AD. I mean, all along this chain, there are infrastructure needs. And again, if we're serious about this, then we need to invest in the Farm Bill. I think is a good place to do that. And then the other one I just want to mention, because we've not mentioned that much, but I think this is a great time to deal with this too, is that a really big reason we waste food is because confusion on date labels. And this impacts not only redistribution of food through food banks and food recovery organizations, but also people every day in their homes, including people who are living at the very margins and really trying to make every dollar count. Because it's really confusing. Most people don't realize that the majority of those dates are about taste and freshness and not about safety. Even people who are really struggling to put food on the table are being misled into wasting food. And so we've been working for some time on trying to get Congress to do this. The agencies could do it on their own, but I think they're unlikely to without a little nudge from Congress to really make those labels clear, so that everyone knows when it's really just about quality versus the foods where you should be more cautious about them. To, can help with donation, with recovery, with making people feel comfortable eating that food and reducing the stigma of food that's past the date but still really totally fine to eat. So, sorry. You say policy, I'm gonna give you all the things, but there's
Okay, that was a very comprehensive answer, but I'm going to ask our other panelists, are there other policies that you think are necessary for us to scale up some of the programs that we've been talking about here today, the strategies or tools that are enacted to ensure that we are wasting less and distributing more?
Yeah, well, I would certainly like to put an exclamation point on everything Emily said and add to it that we really believe as an organization in the dignity and autonomy of people struggling with poverty to make the food choices that are culturally and demographically right for their families. And the SNAP program is the nation's foremost opportunity to do that. And it's the nation's foremost defense against hunger. So we really want to see three things happen in the Farm Bill. I mean, one is we would like to see the SNAP program achieve benefit adequacy, because it almost does violence to people struggling with poverty to put them through the incredible administrative burden of getting on the SNAP program, only to see their benefits run out when they're 12 to 16 days into their 30-day EBT cycle, and then they have to go find food from any number of other sources until their EBT card is recharged at the beginning of the next month. And secondly, we would like to make it easier for people to access SNAP. If the government built a highway system and hid all the on-ramps and then littered the on-ramps with obstacles, we would be outraged. It would make it almost impossible for the program to serve the people it's intended to help. And yet that's what we do with the SNAP program. We make it so difficult to find the program, so difficult to enroll, so difficult to stay on the program that it really deserves people. And thirdly, we'd like to address the eligibility requirements, because 40% of the people in this country who are struggling with food insecurity aren't even eligible for the SNAP program. And those are really important reforms that we could see in the Farm Bill. We also would like to see, increased, as Emily mentioned and I said earlier, increased investment in the infrastructure of food recovery, which exists in the Farm Bill through multiple channels, so that the federal government absorbs the full cost of the capital and operational expenses associated with distributing the food that the federal government provides. But then that infrastructure can further be leveraged to help support all other forms of private sector food rescue. So those are some of the key priorities. There's more, but I know we're running short on time, so I'll pause there.
Leah, anything else that you think we should look to the Congress for support on to scale up what is necessary to move us forward?
Yes. So aside from all of the things that Vince and Emily already mentioned, I think the only thing that I would like to add is that, that there has to be, enough support also and consideration for, and really a bias for innovation. So how do you fund that? How do you define this? What are the risks that, we can take and are allowed to take and have the capacity to take? So, and that's really one of the ways that, we can improve and even definitely increase, the amount of food that we redirect.
Mm-hmm. So none of you raised the enhanced tax deduction, expanding the enhanced tax deduction to those nonprofits that sell food for a Good Samaritan price. Is that a tool that we should consider? And if so, why? If not, why not? Emily, we'll start with you.
You want me? Did you say me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm happy to answer on that. And I think just because I went first, I want to give a +1 to everything that Leah and Vince said too. I think there's just so much opportunity. We have so far to go. And I think, in this country where we have so many resources, there's no reason we can't invest in making sure people who need food get it. They have access to SNAP, and that we're innovating, as Leah said. We're not going to solve this if we just keep doing the same things we've been doing. As I said, if anything, it looks like food waste rates are increasing, not going down. On the enhanced tax deduction, I'm glad you brought it up. Part of the reason I've been talking about it less is that I think, just given what we typically see in the Farm Bill, this is not a likely Farm Bill priority. And so I'm on single track mind, what's going to happen this year? But I think it's a really important point. And I think there's a couple things that we can do in thinking about opportunities. So just for context, one of the best ways that we get businesses, farmers, et cetera, to donate is that they're eligible for an enhanced tax deduction. And that means that they can receive a higher portion of the cost of food that they donate than they can of other goods that they donate, like clothing or whatever. And it was really meant as a way to say, we recognize that we really want food to get to people. It's more costly to donate food than clothing or other goods because it needs to happen really quickly and be in cool, transportation and storage, as Vince mentioned earlier. So there's a couple of problems with it, in terms of thinking about today's needs. I think one is we, for the most part, even though farmers can claim this credit, almost no farmers claim it because the way that it's structured is incredibly difficult for them. You have to do complicated math to figure out, it's like you can claim the lesser of two prices and you get a deduction, and a lot of farms don't even make enough money to use a deduction. So I think one big change would be creating an alternative mechanism that farmers could opt for to take, that's a credit that's more simple for them than the deduction. I think the other big thing is we've all talked about one of the big infrastructure challenges, that one of the biggest is transportation. And some states like California and other countries actually give a tax credit that covers transportation, not only the value of the food itself. That would really unlock a lot of opportunity in terms of covering this really very real cost that has only gone up over the past few years. And then lastly, one of the big changes in the Good Samaritan law under the Food Donation Improvement Act was to protect donation that goes to a nonprofit that offers the food at a low cost and helps cover some of the transportation and staff, expanding that to the tax benefit as well. So right now, a business can only receive a tax benefit if they give to a nonprofit that gives it away for free. And again, the cost of really recovering and offering food has gone up. It doesn't mean that everyone has to use that model, but it would allow for some models that we know have been successful that offer food at a low price. And again, the money would go just to a nonprofit that would just be using it to expand their footprint. So I think this is like a huge opportunity. I don't want to diminish how big I think the opportunity is. I think it's one of the top incentives for businesses to donate. It's just been, it seems unlikely it would be in the Farm Bill, but maybe if Congress really wanted to do something on reducing food waste, they can really do whatever they want. I just think it's less likely.
Sorry.
So Leah, is there anything you'd like to add to Emily's response regarding the enhanced tax deduction?
Yes, I mean, I think it was much anticipated change in the last act that, that nonprofits that actually, sell the recovered food, let's say it cooks it into meals and then resells that at a reduced price. Possibly, I know that much of the goal of nonprofits is to sell it at a much reduced price than, non-health promoting food. And so again, addressing nutrition security in that way versus, a fast food that might be not as beneficial, a nice 3-course meal that, has healthy vegetables, selling for less than the $1 meal. Right. And before the Food Donation Improvement Act, there was no way for a nonprofit to be able to get support for that. And then it increases the liability of the business that donates it. So removing all that already takes off a lot of that friction. So any improvement of that is only an upside.
Vince, anything you'd like to add?
Well, first, I just want to flag that Emily said that the Farm Bill is happening this year, and I intend to hold her to that. So thank you, Emily, for putting that together. Secondly, no, I'm good. I want to talk with Emily further because some of the ideas about how to enhance the tax deductibility process and make it accessible to more donors is really innovative. We find in the Feeding America system that we have contracts with national retailers that serve that very efficiently, because if a particular grocery chain has 300 stores, rather than each of the store managers being responsible for finding the appropriate charitable partner, the local Feeding America food bank finds the appropriate charitable partner and backstops so that if there's a disruption in food rescue, they can go pick it up. But one of the biggest advantages is that grocery chain gets a roll-up report from our Meal Connect technology platform that itemizes all of the pounds by store that they received over an increment of time, which they can hand to their CFO for the tax deduction. But you can't that's not scalable to everybody who wants to engage in food donation. And a lot of the food that's not being rescued today simply isn't going to aggregate or see the advantages. And so I definitely would like to engage in ongoing conversations about how we could improve the ability of food donors to access the tax deductibility. On the other issue of just, expanding the tax deduction to entities that would sell food, I mean, it's not going to come as a surprise to anybody that we have concerns about that, being that we distributed 5.5 billion meals last year, all of which were free. And we wouldn't want to create any sort of revisions to the process that would incentivize donors to give money that should be going or could be going and is going to charitable distribution to instead go to for sale distribution, because obviously none of us on this call believe that people struggling with poverty should have to pay more for something that they're getting for free. But that being said, we don't want the status quo. We don't want the false choice between the status quo and innovation. We understand that this is a complex and layered conversation. And we see an opportunity through the liability extension that was just created to begin to understand how regulations can be promulgated that protect the safe lanes of donated food to the charitable food system, and even allow that to expand while also allowing opportunities for experimentation to capture even more food going to waste.
Well, that is what we've identified is we need more conversation. And as a community, we were successful in supporting the passage of the enhancements to the liability. So for all of the issues that we've talked about today, we need the same community to come together on issues related to the Farm Bill, the Farm to Box program, innovation in the system to reduce waste, and most importantly, when that waste is reduced for the benefit of hungry and malnourished people across this country, for us to work together to achieve those goals. So I have one last question before I let you all go and let our audience go. What gives you hope about what is possible from both a legislative standpoint as well as from a new strategies innovation standpoint for not just reducing waste, but most importantly, for addressing the challenges of ending hunger? Let's again start with you, Emily.
Well, I would say the things that give me hope, I guess a couple. One, the way that we got into all of this has been working with innovative organizations like Food Rescue Hero, like Feeding America, which continues to innovate. We just heard about Meal Connect, a number of businesses. I mean, there's so much energy out there to figure this out. So where we've come in has been the more people are innovating, the more it comes up with legal questions because law is backward looking. And I'm confident that we can figure this out. I think we saw a success last year. We saw success in the last Farm Bill. I would love to see us move more quickly because there's so much need, but I think there's just a growing awareness about this. And then I think the other thing that gives me hope is in my program, we're working with law students every day that are getting to learn about this. And a lot of our students are now out there in leadership positions. So I get to feel really good that we're like proliferating future leaders that are going to do better and do, get into Congress, get into the agencies, get into the White House and kind of care about this and be thoughtful about how to do it better.
Leah, what gives you hope? We have 2 minutes left. Give me a minute.
I'm going to speak from the innovation standpoint. I think one of the most important things that we have to remember when we're answering, when we are trying to tackle our biggest challenges is that there is not one solution. And it's very, very dangerous when we become dependent on one solution. And especially for, UN SDG 2, like zero hunger. We know that there's 40 million Americans, experiencing food insecurity. It takes many, many solutions, and often innovations come from organizations that, are not averse to risk because, there's nothing, there's an idea and they want to see it happen and they can make it happen. And we see so many food rescue organizations, thousands of them all over the United States that are, again, as you mentioned, are doing this independently because they see waste happening and they're just going to do something about it right now. And often when we look at those organizations, there's very little support because they're very small nonprofits. And I think if there is more support and more diversification of support, then we have more of a chance, as a cohort, as a community of nonprofits, to really make a dent in making sure that the disconnect between food waste and food insecurity, that gap, closes.
Fantastic. Vince, you get the last word.
I second what was said. I do believe, as you said at the beginning, Earth Feeding America Network is 60,000 local church pantries and food pantries and soup kitchens and distributors of food from the 200 partner food banks. And it is stunning the amount of innovation that is happening in communities all across the country every day, with so many people united around the singular belief that we don't have to have hunger in this country. That's what gives me inspiration.
Fantastic. Emily, Leah, Vince, thank you. To our audience, thank you for being with us. What this tells me, we have some work to do, but there's hope for what we can actually achieve if we work together. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.